tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Good afternoon from Auckland. My name is Murray Bruce. I'm the director of the Helen Foundation. Thank you for joining today's conversation, exploring how congestion charging might be implemented in New Zealand in the years ahead. The Helen Foundation is a non-partisan, member-supported public policy think tank. We're focused on developing long-term solutions to New Zealand's key policy challenges. Through our partnership with WSP in New Zealand, we've produced a range of reports on sustainable urban environments over the past nearly 6 years. And one of our most popular recent reports examined how to ensure congestion charging could be implemented both effectively and fairly in New Zealand. Given the attention that congestion charging has been receiving in recent months, we thought it was timely to revisit the issue. And we're very pleased to be co-hosting this discussion with the New Zealand Initiative, another non-partisan member-supported think tank that has thought a lot about this issue. And you'll shortly be hearing from the initiative's chief economist, Eric Krapp, one of our panelists today. Links to our foundations and the New Zealand Initiative's reports are posted in the chat section of the webinar. I'd also like to acknowledge our wonderful partners at WSP in New Zealand, whose support and expertise helps us produce reports on a wide range of topics related to sustainable urban environments. And as always, a very warm welcome to our Helen Clark Foundation members. If you're not a member of the foundation, but you find these sessions valuable, you can sign up to become a member on our website. That's helenclark.foundation. If you sign up this month, you get a free book, which is based on foundation research. So it's a great time to join. Before we begin today's webinar, I'll just quickly note that our foundation has another webinar running 1 p.m. Tuesday next week, exploring our latest report with WSP, looking at the role of residential insurance in climate adaptation. And you can register for that on our website or via the link that will shortly be in the comment section. And then finally, for those of you who haven't joined many webinars before, as we always say, this is a webinar, not a normal Zoom call. Your cameras and microphones are off, so you should feel very free to eat your lunch, safe from the knowledge that no one can see you or hear you. Would be very happy for you to participate in this webinar, and the best way for you to do that is by submitting questions by typing them to Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. Later in the webinar, around about the 12:40 mark, our moderator will put those questions to our panelists. You'll also see a separate chat function. As I say, we put other links into that section, but if you want a question to be asked to our panelists, please put it in the Q&A area. So that's it for housekeeping. We're very happy to be joined today by Nadine Dodge, Principal Economist at Te Waihanga, the Infrastructure Commission. Nadine will be moderating today's discussion. So thank you very much for joining us today, Nadine, and over to you.
Nā koutou katoa. Thanks for coming along, everyone. I will start with a bit of an introduction to congestion charging and the current state of play in New Zealand. So you may or may not be aware that congestion charging is a process by which you charge motorists in order to manage congestion on our roads. It's been used overseas in several jurisdictions to great success, but it's currently not possible in New Zealand because it's not enabled by our legislative frameworks. You can charge tolls on motorways, but it's currently not possible for councils or others to charge on local roads for congestion. However, congestion charging is increasingly of interest in New Zealand, with multiple cities expressing interest in introducing schemes. It's increasingly of interest at the national level as well. In 2021, the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee held an inquiry into congestion charging, and there was a recommendation supported by all political parties to progress legislation to enable congestion charging. However, it wasn't progressed under the last government. However, in August of this year, the Transport Minister Brown announced that the government will introduce congestion charging legislation this year in 2024 to enable time of use charging schemes in New Zealand. So the topic is incredibly timely. And first, I'll hand it over to each of the panelists to quickly introduce yourself and just tell us very quickly, yes, no, maybe, do you support congestion charging? And can you please support your answer with a quick sentence on why you hold that position? So start over to Eric.
Sure. Eric Crampton, Chief Economist with the New Zealand Initiative. So long as a congestion charge is focused on reducing congestion and ensuring efficient throughput of traffic, I'm totally in favor. It makes better use of the roads, makes better use of people's time, makes sure that we don't wind up over-investing in infrastructure that could be better managed just through demand management.
Excellent. Callie.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. My name's Carly Mercier. I'm at the Helen Clark Foundation and WSP Fellow. Yes, I do support congestion charging in the right place and with the right design, which takes into account equity considerations. And the reasons being to improve living in cities, the quality of living in cities, to reduce emissions and to reduce air pollution and to improve public transport.
Mehmet.
Hi everyone, Mehmet Ahmet, Motor Projects Director within WSP. Yes, I do support congestion charging. I haven't recently just come from the UK. I think in terms of my sort of views and stuff, I think it's, it gives us the opportunity to optimize what we already have. I think in terms of the sort of network we have, also thinking about the whole behaviour change piece as well, I think it's a real critical part of trying to sort of encourage people to think slightly differently as well. So that's probably from me, Nadine.
Thank you. And over to you, Scott.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Scott Wilson. I lead CDM Smith's practice on road user charging in Australia and New Zealand. Yes, I support congestion pricing. I think it makes roads operate more efficiently and fundamentally, as long as it can make the experience of those who pay better and enable the network to operate more efficiently and not distort trip patterns elsewhere and not divert it elsewhere, then it has the potential to have enormous benefits economically, socially, and environmentally.
Thank you. So now I'm keen to talk a bit more about what congestion charging is and what the goals of it are. And if we do it, why do we want to do it? So I'll start with Eric, please.
Sure. Economists have been looking at this effectively forever. So there are hints of it in Adam Smith. You can see it in Arthur Pigu's initial discussions of externalities. It's one of the examples that he came up with, where if I decide to go on a road when everybody else is on there, I impose a cost on them. That's not factored into my decisions. Classic externality that may need to be internalized. William Vickery worked on it. He's a god of pricing. You can see his work in there as well. Now, the reason that we like it is not just that it mitigates the externality, but it also makes the roads just work better, because we're already paying for congestion in our time right now. So if you're trying to get from A to B as a tradie, you're paying with your time when your billable hourly rate would be an awful lot higher than what you'd be having to spend on a congestion charge to ease traffic. The other reason that I like it is you start discovering which roading investments make sense. So, for example, here in Wellington, where I live, we've been debating whether to put in a second tunnel for Mount Victoria. I have no clue whether it makes sense to put one in there. We get an awful lot of congestion. If you had a 50-cent charge to get through the tunnel at peak times, and that got rid of congestion, it seems pretty unlikely that a second tunnel could pay its own way. If it took a $50 congestion charge to get traffic to manageable levels during peak times, that would be a case for building a second tunnel and charging it properly. So you can put this as part of an overall comprehensive road pricing scheme, looking at how we run road user charging as sort of baseline, run congestion charging to mitigate the externalities from congestion and ensure that the roading network can support the greatest number of vehicle kilometers traveled as possible, given the roading investment. I also like it because it's part of like a bundle of things that we should be doing, where there's a standing principle in economics that you need at least as many policy instruments for dealing with problems as you have problems. Congestion is one problem that needs its own solution. We already have a solution for carbon emissions that come out of tailpipes. That's our emission trading scheme. Add a congestion charge on top of that to deal with congestion. Add better road pricing for dealing with fixed costs, and you start getting a bundle that makes for a far better road network.
Thanks, Eric. I'm keen to hear a bit from Scott on this topic. So tell us a bit more about why we should do congestion charging and what we should not be doing when we're trying to do congestion charging.
Sure. Roads fundamentally are an economic good. They are the most fundamental part of the transport network. They connect people, they connect goods, they connect properties. And as such, they should operate efficiently. Now, we price roads now. Every person driving a car in New Zealand, on average, pays 7.6 cents per kilometre, but that's not very visible. They prepay it through fuel or through road user charges, and it's just an average infrastructure charge. Now, most roads, most of the time, are not congested. In fact, most roads are never congested, but some roads are. And the effect that that has upon people's mobility, upon the costs of moving goods, and also people's time, and the penalty of time of congestion. People take into account, well, people leave a bit early, but that's time it takes out of time they spend with their families and their own private life. It also affects them in their employment. It also affects the efficiency of businesses, just as Eric was saying before. Trades can do fewer jobs because of congestion. So congestion is a major problem. Now, most cities in the world have used two types of solutions for it, and they're both supply side. They either provide more road capacity, well, they usually provide more road capacity, or provide alternatives. And no major city anywhere in the world has fixed severe traffic congestion simply through supply side methods. I mean, as we all know, you can keep adding more capacity to the road network, and while it fixes some problems, maybe temporarily, it won't fix all the problems. You can't practically build your way out of congestion, particularly in inner cities. Likewise with alternatives. You can provide alternatives, you can provide better public transport, and there are lots of cities that do that, but ultimately it doesn't provide an alternative for everyone. You can't generally move goods by any other means than on the road network. There are people who are going to have to drive at certain times. So pricing provides a solution to moderate demand on the busiest roads at particular times, enable people to consider alternatives. And as Eric said, it flags, do I need to travel at this time on this particular road? And people may change mode, they may change time of travel, they may drive a little less frequently. That's been the experience elsewhere. So congestion pricing, if it's designed effectively, if targets where and when congestion is at a price that is at the right level of elasticity to change demand, can help the network to flow more efficiently. You can get more use out of the network with pricing because you get more throughput. And it means that some people decide, well, look, maybe I'll drive at a different time. I'll go by different means, and the whole network can operate better, and it sends signals to investment. And like Eric said, if there's parts of the network that continue to be congested, had this in London lately, they're building a new tunnel called the Silvertown Tunnel because the Blackwall Tunnel is congested all day, all the time. There is a need for more capacity. So targeted capacity after pricing means you can build capacity more efficiently.
Thanks, Scott. Callie, Mamet, did you have anything to add on this point?
I might just add, just briefly, I mean, you guys covered it really comprehensively, but the issue of air pollution, I think, is one which is really relevant in terms of when you have a lot of cars idling for a lot of time, you have a lot more air pollution created. And, there are several thousand people in New Zealand killed each year by air pollution, which is just huge. And a large chunk of that is from vehicle emissions. I think Ministry of Environment estimates about 70% of the cost of air pollution in New Zealand is caused by vehicle emissions. So I think finding a way to make traffic move more smoothly and less idling and less waiting and reducing the length of commuting time is a really good thing to be aiming for.
Excellent. So to summarize, congestion charging seems like a really good idea. It's a demand-side solution that is a much more cost-effective way of achieving the goal of reducing congestion. But if we look overseas and within New Zealand and overseas, we see a lot more of trying supply-side solutions and building motorways than we do of trying to manage demand through congestion charging. If we look internationally, there's only about, depending on how you define it, 3 or 5, between 3 and 5 congestion schemes operating worldwide. So while it might be a really good idea in theory, there might be broad broad spread support among experts to do it. It just doesn't get implemented that much in practice. So I'm keen to talk about what we can do to actually make congestion charging a success for New Zealand. What are the really important things to get right to ensure that congestion charging can happen and we can achieve those benefits? So I'd like to hear from each of the panelists on this one, if possible.
I can go first if you want, Nadine. Yeah. So I guess in terms of what I would call a certain ingredients and stuff to sort of like sell a sort of scheme like congestion charging or road pricing, I think you have to have a really, really good message in terms of what you're trying to achieve for the sort of area, the city that you're working in. Obviously, we tried it in Cambridge, and we're trying to sell the sort of benefits of what a scheme could bring, like congestion charging. So it's all the wider stuff that comes in, i.e. around the sort of better buses, better rail network, better walking and cycling, so people can actually connect to the areas that they need to connect to through it. So it's really, really trying to sell the sort of vision and a dream right from the start. And if you don't get that right from the start, I think it's actually quite difficult to what I would call the sort of naysayers to actually win them over. And making sure that once you have them on your side and you've sort of sold the sort of dream to them, it's then trying to define and design that framework with those people. So yeah, that's how I think that it should happen.
Okay, so we've got selling the vision and the dream to the public. Any other thoughts?
Sure, I'll jump in. I'll defer to Scott on some of the international examples, but things that I would see as being important are making sure that it remains very focused on the one job it is meant to achieve, because it would be easy for this to turn into a politically polarized thing, and that would kill it. An easy way to politically polarize it would be to say, this is about reducing car use. Then it's an anti-car thing. You don't want it to be that because it shouldn't be that. Thought about properly, congestion charging is really pro-travel, right? You're able to get to where you want to be effectively. You'd also want to be thinking about some of the equity issues that Callie had mentioned. One solution that I like that I've never seen implemented anywhere, but makes sense from an economist perspective, take all of the money that's collected by the congestion charge, put it in a bucket, divide it up among everybody who's in the city. That way, there's always going to be a suspicion that people are using a congestion charge as a revenue grab or for other purposes. If it is transparently returned to everybody in the town that's paying for it, those concerns go away. And so too does some of the temptation to use the congestion charge to raise revenue. Because if you're trying to use it for revenue raising, you're going to mess up getting the prices right.
Cool. So keep it to the vision, reducing congestion only. How about you, Scott or Callie? Are you keen to jump in?
Yeah, I'd reiterate what Eric says, because I mean, there's a long list of cities that have tried and failed to do congestion pricing. I'll add Edinburgh, I'll add Manchester. Mehmet's got mentioned Cambridge. I'd add San Francisco seems to be stalled. There are multiple US cities that have gone down a path and it's just been shut down. Copenhagen, you'd have thought is an ideal place to do that. It's only just starting to talk about it again after 10 years of it being shut down as an idea. The Netherlands has tried more times than I've got fingers on my hands, and it just keeps failing. And the main reason is that too many of the people who are pushing and advocating it are not communicating to the people who have to pay and what is in it for them. And to communicate it as being about a revenue raise makes the argument about how do you raise tax and how do you spend the money, and not about the tool itself. Now, congestion pricing will raise revenue, and there are things you can do with that. And that's a useful political debate to have. But unless you are using the pricing tool as a way to make those who pay gain something, and sure, some people are going to be priced off, but it's got to be a better experience for them, then you are going to fail. Now, Singapore has succeeded, and it does have a slightly different political environment, but it's succeeded and maintained it and expanded it because it has maintained a level of service in its operation. Stockholm has sustained it because they have adapted it and maintained a level of service. And if you pay whatever amount of money it is, $5 or $10, you want to make sure that the traffic's flowing and it's working reasonably well. The problem, I think, and I think London has this problem, is that London introduced a scheme and it was successful and it achieved a lot, but it hasn't kept pace. And now when you talk about expanding it in London today, and I lived 14 years in London, people say, well, the congestion charge doesn't do anything. It just raises money because the traffic crawls. It hasn't kept pace. And I think that's part of the problem in the UK, is that people just see it, they see it cynically. They see it as, you're not doing this to make my life better or make the traffic move better. You're doing this to take some money and maybe you'll take away the lane as well, and I'll be no better off. So you've got to give people something, and you've got to give something to the people who are directly affected by it.
So focusing on the benefits and make sure that the benefits keep delivering. How about you, Callie? Do you have any thoughts on what are the key ingredients for success?
Yeah, I mean, we, Helen Clark Foundation and WSP wrote a report on congestion charging a couple of years ago, Te Ara Matatika, which is on our website, and I think the link's in there too if you want to read it. And there was a strong focus in there on ensuring that any model would be equitable and not lead to worse outcomes for people who are on lower incomes. One of the things that has held up, I think, congestion charging programs elsewhere is the concern that for some people who absolutely have to drive because there are not other public transport options available, or perhaps they do shift work, or perhaps they're disabled and can't use public transport for whatever reason, that congestion charge might disproportionately impact them. So I think part of the design of the system has to be really clear on how we're going to deal with those issues. For example, and I think they can be dealt with really well. Like they did modelling for an Auckland CBD congestion charging zone and found that wouldn't disproportionately impact people on lower incomes for a number of reasons. Things like most people who are commuting into the city are using public transport or are from wealthier suburbs. People from the poorer areas are not necessarily going to be going into the city anyway at the times that are going to be charged. So, and that works in Auckland because there's really good public transport. But if you were to put it in different parts of the city, you might find it had a bigger impact on people with lower incomes, that they were paying disproportionately more because they just didn't have other options. So I think being really clear about having good public transport in place before you do a congestion charging zone is really important, and modelling that really, really well. And thinking about what other cities have done is thinking about exemptions or discounts for people who are forced to travel through no fault of their own, don't have other options, and would potentially be badly impacted by a high congestion charge. Another thing to think about is things like people who are disabled, chronically ill, neurodivergent, who can't use public transport, who may be required to travel into the congestion charging zone, and just thinking about whether they just don't have to pay at all, or whether they don't have to pay if they travel outside of peak hours, or, you know, how are we going to model that? And drawing on what you guys were saying before, just really good public consultation about issues like that, because I think every single group is going to have different issues that they're going to need to have discussed and aired and a solution found for. So just being really clear on the public engagement and responding to concerns that all the different groups have. Another thing I'd say is things like buses, public transport and emergency vehicles, mobility vehicles, I don't think should have to pay. There should be one somewhere around that, just because we want to push people onto public transport, so we don't want to be making the price higher if we can help it.
Thanks, Callie. So
I might push back on a little bit of that. So I'd be nervous about framing this as pushing people onto public transit, because that is what will get you into the polarized situation that has the right wing saying, this is stupid, we're not going for this, it's part of the anti-car agenda. So I'd suggest not doing that. I would also suggest that one simple way of handling the equity concerns, which might not be perfect, but is practicable, if we're running a kind of congestion dividend, as I talked about before, you could provide a higher congestion dividend for households whose vehicle account that is linked to a community services card, because we already provide all kinds of discounted services for people that have the community services card and are eligible for it for one reason or another. You could provide a higher dividend to those same households and deal with the equity issue that way through a mechanism that is already set up and established, rather than paralyzing it through consultation. I'm also nervous about requiring public transit to precede congestion charging, because congestion charging is what will build demand for a sustainable public transit system. And if we delay it until there's a good public transit system, that can just stymie things forever.
I think I do agree with that to a certain extent. I know in New York, for example, they are bringing in congestion charging, and one of the main things they want to do is use the money to improve their public transport system. So they're doing a bit of this and a bit of that. So I think I do agree that that a congestion charge can really help to improve the public transport system. And I would say I think that that's what the money should be used for, because I think that actually helps people see the benefits of the congestion charging, because they see that they're getting something back. They see that they're getting other options back where they can actually travel more quickly and hopefully more cheaply overall. So I think that a good design would include money going back to the city that is paying the charges, and that they can see what they're getting. It might be a combination of better rapid transport and maybe fixing potholes as well, so drivers feel they're getting something. But the more that is put into public transport, the lower the congestion will be, and the more worthy it is to actually spend money on congestion if you're a driver. I think that's how I see it anyway.
So it sounds like there's some slight disagreement in the nuances beginning to emerge, which is good to see. And this is the kind of stuff that's really important to talk through. Working through all those micro details is so important. I've just got one more question before we turn it over to audience questions, and it's digging a bit more into that international experience. So we've heard that there's a few cities that have managed to put congestion charging in place. Some of them might be perceived as more successful than others, as well as several cities, especially in the UK, that have given it a go and not gotten systems across the line. So I'm keen to hear from Scott and Mehmet in particular, who have some knowledge of international experiences. What can we learn from those international experiences, the good, the bad? What can New Zealand take on board? And for the audience, feel free to put questions in the chat. We'll be going to that next, as well as upvoting other people's questions if there's other people's questions that you think are good. So first to Mehmet, maybe.
Oh, thanks, Undine. Yeah, so obviously my experience is working on a few schemes in the UK. I think obviously we try to take it out from that, we try to take it away from that political arena. We do, but it's actually quite difficult because it can be quite polarizing in terms of the conversation. When I was talking earlier and I was saying about, trying to sort of build that vision, and you build that vision not just with members of the public, those hard to reach groups. It is also the political members as well, because you need them to be in line with you to champion. You need a champion to try and push this through. And if you don't have that along the way, similar to what's happened with our Cambridge example, it never sort of like got off the ground. So yeah, it was I think some of the key parts is, even if you try to take it out from that political sort of arena, it's something that will inevitably end up there, because at the end of the day, they have to make a decision that the people that they represent is actually going to be charged, and they need to see the benefits from what the scheme will bring. Scott, anything else?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. For there to be success, I think a scheme, it's helpful to start fairly small. And I think some of the ones that have been pushed forward have been too ambitious. I'd say Cambridge was too ambitious. I think the scale of it was far too ambitious. I think the same has happened in some other cities where I think to some extent, bless them, transport planners and economists will say, well, this will fix the congestion. But what you need to do is demonstrate on a small scale that it actually works, it's not frightening, and you can do something bigger. Now, if we think of Auckland, you might think about the downtown, you might think about one motorway corridor or one corridor, and just show, look, we're doing this in the morning peak for 2 hours, we'll see how this works. And show people that actually it performs well, it's not raising a lot of money, because it won't on that scale, and say, well, do you like the results of this? Because we can do more of that. And that's what has happened in some of the successful places. I mean, Singapore obviously has done that from a downtown cordon to now a network with 70 odd charging points, and they're putting a more elaborate system in now. But also Stockholm, which started with its cordon, then put it through on the bypass route through that. It has scaled up. I think you have to demonstrate it. People don't trust that this will actually make it better for them. I think by focusing it on time and location, I don't think you should run it all day. I think you should run it at peaks, maybe morning peak and then afternoon peak. You have to communicate really clearly. People need to know where and when this work will operate. And I know my experience from Manchester was that 40% of people polled thought that the Ring motorway, which was the cordon point, they'd be charged if they drove on the motorway rather than the motorway being the bypass for it. And then people just said, no, this is ridiculous. I've got no alternative. It's like if you want to charge the Western Ring route in Auckland to say, well, what am I doing? There's no public transport for me to replace those trips. So communicate very clearly. It's not a toll, and start small and scale up and make it easy for people to use and understand. And over time, you can expand it and make it more sophisticated, more interesting. I'd minimize discounts and exemptions. I think there are some obvious ones, which Carly mentioned. I think emergency services, people with disabilities, there are ones that you can obviously exclude, but I would try and keep a lid on that. Otherwise, look, London basically had made taxis and what is Uber until recently all exempt, and they just drove around all day in central London, picking up all their jobs, and you don't want to do that.
Thanks, Scott. And now we'll head over to the comment or to the question and answers and see what questions are coming in there. So the first question is, when does it make sense to do congestion charging? So is there a threshold? Is it population? Is it level of congestion in which a road user charging or congestion charging scheme makes sense? And I guess what is the threshold based on the scheme being profitable or making more revenue than cost to administer, or what is the threshold at which you should or could use congestion charging? Open to anyone.
I'd say start in the places that are most congested, where congestion is obviously doing the most to reduce vehicle throughput. Put the system in for those places, incur the fixed cost, then watch to see which other ones need to have it added. Of course, you don't want to be thinking about it as part of a system to avoid rat running. There's some obvious ways to do that in Wellington. I think Scott's been thinking about that a little bit as well, but that's how I would start thinking about it.
Thank you. No other comments on when we should use congestion charging?
I think I just echo Eric. I think you can start small. Seoul in South Korea has one congestion charge on one tunnel, and it works, and they've had it for years. You don't have to do a big elaborate scheme. You don't have to make it large and complicated. I think target it. You can have a small time period in one location, and it should probably pay for itself. But I think that's when and where you do it, and particularly where you have no other options. I mean, if you've got a bad intersection, you could just fix by adding a lane somewhere. You probably should do that rather than pricing. But it needs to be severe. I think sustained long-term congestion in a particular location and time.
So it sounds like monitoring congestion and knowing the state of congestion in your cities might be important starting place. So Peter says, I'm interested in Mehmet's comment about getting the community on side and involved in designing the system. I guess the wider kind of question here is, who should approve schemes, and what is the role for the public or citizens to be involved, and what's the ideal way to get schemes approved and get the public on board?
Happy to answer that. So in terms of the sort of designing part of it, we had citizens assemblies, we had meetings with hard to reach groups to help us design it. We went out for a consultation event that we had 24,000 responses, which was huge. I think it was on par with the London congestion charge. It was when they went out to consult. So it was from our perspective, actually hugely successful in the sense that we reached so many people. We actually reached, actually spoke to schools and some school children and parents as well in terms of how they felt about it. Come back to the point, Nadine, in terms of who approves it. Obviously, from a UK perspective, it was the eventual sort of decisions and sign off. Secretary of State obviously gives you the sort of permissions and stuff, but for the vote to go through, we had our highway authority and our mayoral authority that would ultimately make the decision. They're ultimately telling everyone that we've got a scheme that works for the region and stuff. So it's giving that. I guess it's giving it in the hands of the people, that it's allowing them to be part of that decision making, and that's how, eventually it never obviously went through for us.
Cheers. So I know we've talked about it a bit already, but I guess the audience wants more on how we use the funds that are collected. Should they be used for transport improvements? If so, what kind of transport improvements? Should it be public transport, cycling, walking, or should it be more directly towards road user benefits? How do we use the funds, and should they be returned back to people? What are people's thoughts on the use of revenue that's raised through schemes?
Well, really, my answer is whatever gets it over the line without screwing up the incentives in the system. My preferred answer is the kind of congestion dividend that scales to people's travel. So I'll expand on that a little bit because it came up in a couple of the questions in the chat. If you're using a gantry to be checking how often cars going through during peak times for charging them, you can just keep the cameras on and know how often people are using those routes at off-peak times, divide up the collected revenue by the amount of travel. Then it's proportionate to the actual use of the route, but the rebate is not scaled to your time of travel. You could scale it with the community services card. So then you wouldn't have any of the worries about, well, are you rebating it to people from Auckland who drive in Wellington? Well, sure, if their plate goes through and they're paying a congestion charge, they would get a small amount of the congestion dividend proportionate to their travel, and make sure that all of that is net of the cost of running the system. I like that option. I think that the case for public transit, this is a weird one. There is a good case in economics for subsidizing buses when there is no congestion charge. That case weakens considerably when there is a congestion charge, which makes it a little bit weird to be using a congestion charge to subsidize buses. But again, whatever really gets it over the line without screwing up the incentives.
I was just going to add to that as well. I think for me, I think it's important that, or it makes logical sense to me that the money is collected goes towards further reducing congestion if it can do, because that's why you're collecting it in theory. So I think people are going to accept it more of if they think that the money is actually going to help reduce congestion further and further improve their enjoyment or their ability to get places quickly. And I think that's been shown to be the case in some places around the world too. Whether that goes back to them, I mean, I like Eric's idea in that it's beautifully economically pure, and but also I like the idea of having that money available to actually make driving and other forms of transport more enjoyable and better and healthier and so on and so forth. So if we can use that money to improve rapid transport, to improve active transport as well, so we get more people onto cycles and walking and so on. I don't think that's anti-car. I think that's pro-car, because cars can actually drive more easily. And so I think that's how I would be wanting to spend the money. But as Eric says, I guess it's to do with what you can actually get over the line. But I think people can see the benefits from spending it on public transport, and I think that's worthwhile to do that.
I'll just briefly mention that Stockholm was an interesting example, because Stockholm had a trial. It ran the trial, it had a referendum, which barely passed it. And of course, at the same time, the government changed and said, yes, we'll do this, and we'll do this to fund the bypass motorway around Stockholm, which to ensure that the major traffic could completely avoid Stockholm. So a lot of the money has gone on that, and people said, yeah, okay, that's fine. It means I don't have to drive anywhere near the congestion zone now if I'm bypassing Stockholm. But every few years it changes, and I wouldn't be too tied down into what money's spent, and you don't want to gold plate any bits of infrastructure necessarily. And I think every few years it'll change and alter. And in the long run, I would actually say it should be offsetting the cost of your off-peak travel, so that if we ultimately have a full road pricing system at some point in the future, I'm thinking 10, 15, 20 years, it should be really, really cheap to drive off-peak on empty roads, basically, so that people who do shift work in the middle of the night are paying next to nothing to drive them. And why not? It should be offsetting, so that, like other areas where we have peak pricing, like we have, electricity, you might get a free day for driving, off peak. So just be innovative and creative about what we do with it.
Well, I think that leads into the next question we have, where Stuart had asked, how is parking pricing in the CBD managed as part of a road pricing scheme? But I might expand that to say, how would congestion charging be integrated or not with our suite of our suite of ways of charging motorists? So that's parking prices, but we also have road user charges and fuel excise duties, and we also have tolls. So how could it be integrated or not, or managed thoughtfully with those other pricing schemes in mind?
What I
Or
would,
not?
what I'd really like as part of this is just requiring an open API on it, so that providers of payment systems can have a standard tech for interfacing with all of these systems. I don't think that the parking charges in Wellington or anywhere else should vary with the congestion charge. Again, every policy goal you have should have its own separate policy instrument, or you're going to be making a mess of things. If you set the parking charge optimally and the congestion charge optimally, you don't have to worry about how they intersect. But you want to have a standard API so that you can build systems that make things really easy for users.
Well, any other thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, there's also an opportunity there, Nadine, as well, regarding the sort of parking stock you have. Obviously, if there's introduction of some sort of congestion charge, there might actually be opportunities to reuse that space where the parking is as well. And we looked at parking strategies in some of the other cities in terms of, if you were to introduce a charge, some environmental charge, whatever it needs to be, repurposing that space for freight logistics centres potentially, or redeveloping the space for development above, housing development. And we all have issues around housing stock and stuff, and development and delivery. So there are some opportunities there as well. So I think we need to just be flexible. I like that idea of being flexible in terms of what it could achieve.
Well, thank you. That sounds like there's an interest from the panel in using pricing signals to solve all sorts of problems in the world. All right, so if we don't have anyone else pitching in, next question is in general, the panel seems to be leaning towards relatively simple schemes with limited exemptions and caps, not over engineering things. What about variable pricing, different times of day, different vehicle types? In general, I kind of like this question of how much should things be simple versus how much should things be tailored. And with that in mind, that there will be legislation introduced very shortly. What do people think about legislation that's very limiting and prescriptive versus legislation that's a bit more open or flexible in terms of what schemes should look like?
I think that the initial schemes should be simple, but the legislation should be flexible to enable discovery of what works best.
Yeah, I think that schemes should be able to evolve quickly and adapt quite responsively to conditions. If I take, I'll cite Singapore again, but it is the gold standard. I mean, every 3 months, Singapore measures the average speed on the parts of the network that are priced, and it adjusts the prices accordingly. So if the traffic is flowing too freely, they'll say that, well, actually, we are pricing it too much and we have to lower charges. We don't need to have them as high. And if the traffic is flowing too slowly, they will put up the prices at specific times. This is the sort of responsiveness that I think there should be, and it's not something I think you could do effectively in a prescriptive environment that would require regulation or ministerial calls on this. There needs to be a range of responsibility and I think regulatory oversight of it, but just to be able to respond to conditions as they change, and also to deal with events. I mean, events come along, whether it be emergencies, whether it be concerts, and to not just be very rigid in the approach to those sorts of conditions.
Yeah,
It is so, oh, sorry.
Go on, Eric, go on.
Well, it's just so easy to imagine with tech moving at the speed that it is, getting towards dynamic charging, right? That it's just constantly adapting rather than being reviewed every 3 months. You can see that as an outcome in a couple of years. You wouldn't want to prescribe it at the start, but you want to be flexible to enable it.
You took the words right in my mouth, Eric. But yeah, I think you're right there. I think, you know, we looked at various ways around looking at variable charge throughout the day, different peaks. I guess it sort of sets out what is the outcome, what's the objective that you're trying to achieve. I think that's the thing that you need to almost set out right from the start. And I think once you've got that, then you can start designing a scheme that's, I guess, yeah, will give you, you know, the best opportunities and stuff for everybody.
I think there's very clear merits in making sure that if there are charges that are peak focused, that you have shoulder charges that build up to the highest price and down from it. I mean, there's certainly evidence from some of the schemes elsewhere that if you don't do that, people will bunch up. And it's what Singapore did. They actually put 5-minute intervals at certain points, so people wouldn't either speed to try and get there early, or they did slow down to try and get the lower charge. You don't want to do that. You want to make it you know, quite targeted and focused, but it shouldn't be too complicated either.
Cool. We've got a couple of questions coming through about impacts on different groups and potential exemptions. So I think 2 people in the chats had mentioned that in Wellington, the hospital is on the other side of the CBD from where many people are coming from. So in that scenario, lots of people from the north who, whether they work at the hospital or visiting the hospital, might have to pay the cordon charge, even though they're not actually attempting to go to Wellington CBD. But I think this brings up a wider point that different cities have different situations and different people who might be disproportionately impacted, whether it's hospital workers or ports or otherwise. What are people's thoughts on use of exemptions to deal with those sorts of issues, or discounts or tailoring of scheme designs? How much should we allow schemes to provide targeted exemptions to deal with special scenarios like impacts on the hospitals, for example?
I would lean against that. I think that it would, okay. One, you're going to have a mess of trying to decide which groups are worthy of it and which aren't. So you're going to have lobbying forever, and everybody will be able to make a good case, and then the scheme unravels. 2, to the extent that there are equity issues, you can deal with it by giving more money to poorer people through the community services card as part of the congestion dividend or through other benefit payments. 3, if you exempt hospital workers, then you're discouraging people who go to the hospital from using public transit. You, again, deal with that through the community services card rather than messing up road pricing. I'll shut up and let others go.
I'd avoid exemptions by and large, almost like the plague, because I know there are other schemes I've been involved in where, look, I was involved in costing up potential exemptions and other schemes, and the effects of that and the admin costs of that and compliance can be quite horrendous. Like one example is kind of easy. I'd just say the cordon is within State Highway 1. So you go State Highway 1, you avoid it. That's easy. Look, in the future, there may be a scheme that also covers part of that as well. But I think if you can design it to avoid some of those scenarios, and you could do it in Auckland as well, then that'd be my starting point. I think discounts are something you might do for a transitional period. I know a low income discount in Manchester was envisaged to be a 5-year scheme that would allow, take into account the fact that people move where they live and where they work, and therefore you can enable people to adjust where they live and where they work over time and do that. But I think exemptions are, you're opening up a door to a long list of people saying we're special. And are you driving in the peak time? Are you special? I don't think there's actually a very long list of people who really come under that category. And there are other transfers that could be used to compensate for that without undermining the pricing of this and the effectiveness of the scheme.
Yeah,
Cool.
it's, Mehmet, was it you that was talking to me about the hospital scheme in Cambridge where they were trying? Do you want to talk a bit about that? Because that was a really interesting story.
I was, yes. So when we were looking at the actual cordon sustainable travel zone, as we called it, it included, at first it included the hospital, then the hospital was out, then it was back in. There was even trying to design the scheme, and I take Scott's point. It can actually be quite expensive in terms of trying to administer. The hospital in Cambridge, it's one of the biggest hospitals in for the east of England. It's where you have all the sort of palliative care there. And we had to go through an entire process working with the sort of hierarchy within the hospital community and stuff to try and figure out, well, how do we actually charge people come into the hospital? If we looked at a whole day charge, you have obviously you have your doctors, but then also you have your cleaners and stuff, who out of that group of people do we actually include within the sort of exemptions or even just the reimbursement scheme itself? At the end, when we got to the end of trying to design the scheme, we actually put the onus back onto the hospital in terms of, you have to be in charge of reimbursing your staff for a scheme that, we would obviously enable as the authority, but we would ensure that they were in a position to try and reimburse it. But yeah, it was an administrative nightmare, let's just say that, to try and figure out and how to actually do it.
All of this sounds like the debates that get had about exempting things from GST. Other countries run into complete nightmares from trying to exempt meritorious things from GST, and then the whole system's riddled with holes in lobbying, and it can't raise revenue effectively, and it distorts everything. New Zealand has a clean, world-class, best in world, literally, GST. We've resisted those temptations. We can do the same with a congestion charge.
And so it sounds like we're hearing some pretty strong voices on the panel in terms of limiting exemptions to the bare minimum viable product. Cool. So we have two different questions coming in from the chat on I guess two related questions on the compliance or overhead costs of schemes and the technology that's used. And I could see a spectrum here from very basic schemes using very simple technologies to, on the other side of the spectrum saying, oh, let's wait to do congestion charging until we have a perfect scheme where, you get charged different amounts by whichever segment you're on and whichever block of the day you're charging. So interested in people's thoughts on that, of how should the technology be considered in the process of implementing congestion charging, and where should we sit on that spectrum from basic schemes to very complex schemes that might require more technological innovation to be practical.
I mean, I think obviously we should use the best technology we've got at the best price. We don't want to go all bells and whistles and find that we've just signed up to a multi-billion-dollar scheme that we can't afford. So we should be doing what the best we can with the technology we've got and looking to improve that over time potentially if we can. I think one thing we might run up against in terms of public perceptions is if we've got a really bells and whistles type of scheme that tracks where people are at what time of day and so on, that there'll be concerns about privacy issues which we need to deal with in terms of public comms, explaining how that works and making sure there are really good rules in place to keep that information that's gathered private and not being able to be shared with other agencies, for example. So I think that's one thing we need to think about. But I love that idea that Eric floated before of a scheme. It's almost like an Uber. You can check the price before you travel. I like that.
And there's some existing tech that we can leverage on, right? So heavy trucks are already using eRUC. You could have congestion charging run through the eRUC system and then look to see whether other vehicles can be brought onto that system cost effectively.
It seems pretty clear that at least initially New Zealand will be doing a number plate recognition based system. We do that for tolls already. It works efficiently as far as that is concerned. There's no reason why it can't be scaled up to include that. It's still the basic system, and mandating any sort of technology to go into vehicles, or the interesting world of using mobile phones to do this, which has reliability issues. You're still going to have number plate recognition for enforcement of it. And you can do quite a lot of that. And it's certainly much better than it used to be. And you can run it in a way, to take Carly's point around privacy, that, look, if you've got an account, we did your number plate and we get the money, fine, we can just delete the image and we don't care anymore. It's just the people who don't do anything, you have to chase them up. So I think technologically that's where we'll be at. I think the real I think the future may come from the technology that's already built into vehicles, which is currently not easily accessible, to be able to use that to measure road use and report on road use. And that's still a work in progress to some extent, though there are some jurisdictions in the US that do that for some road user charging applications as it stands. So I think longer term, it could be more sophisticated and be easy and seamless, but it's going to be really important to bring people on board with that, because, yep, people will have concerns, and people, they want to opt out in that and just be a part of a basic system that's blunter, then so be it. And they should be able to do that.
So here's another question about the purpose of schemes. It sounded like at the beginning that there seemed to be a bit of consensus across the panel that the purpose should really just be for congestion alleviation only. So Catherine asks, sounds like the panel is saying that it should not be used to reduce transport emissions. Is it purely about congestion? Is that an accurate view of the panel's views?
I think that reduced transport emissions are a good co-benefit of a proper road pricing scheme. It should not be the point of a proper road pricing scheme, because otherwise you're not using it to target congestion. So what things that a congestion charge wouldn't do, if you've got a really smelly old diesel vehicle traveling at peak time, it would be paying the same congestion charge as an electric vehicle traveling at peak time. That doesn't fix things around emissions. You need a separate scheme to fix things around emissions. Keep each thing doing its own job.
Yeah, I'd agree with Eric there, but also to note that schemes that have been implemented around the world have reduced emissions and have reduced air pollution. I think it's a really wonderful co-benefit, and we should be designing the scheme in such a way that it maximizes those co-benefits wherever possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with both Eric and Carly. We were able to sort of calculate the actual impacts that obviously car vehicles have on the area and stuff, and we're able to actually attribute the amount of deaths and stuff to sort of like pollution levels and stuff. So yeah, there is a lot of data out there, so it shouldn't just be, it's definitely a co-benefit. So it's not just about reducing cars off the road. There's a lot more benefits around it.
And I'd say that when we were talking about congestion charging, road pricing and low emission zones are different types of schemes. And there are plenty of examples. There are actually many, many more low emission zones in the world. There are, I think, 30 plus in Germany. There are several in Italy. They're all over Europe. But these are regulatory schemes that are saying if you've got a car that's dirty or a truck that's a certain level, you'll pay something, and everybody else gets to drive. It doesn't do anything for congestion. It doesn't really make any difference. So, and it also from a it may be quite effective as a tool in certain circumstances, but ultimately there is an issue about public acceptability, that the person, my neighbor who can afford a Tesla, can go and drive in and jam up the traffic and jam up the bus that I'm riding in. And that's the sort of issue. I'd keep them very, very clear and have, I think it's pretty clear that what we're talking about at the moment and the government at the moment is looking at doing this to reduce congestion and make the network operate more efficiently. There are other tools that can be used to address not just emissions, and of course carbon emissions are addressed through the ETS.
Yeah, and also worth remembering that cities vary considerably, right? So when I lived in Christchurch, you get the air inversion, you get effectively smog. You live in Wellington, it regularly makes the top 10 global best air quality in the world because we've got like, I don't know, 3,000 air changes per minute with the wind. You probably don't need to be targeting particulate emissions in Wellington as compared to other places. Keep these things separate.
Excellent. So we've just come to 1 o'clock, and I think we've canvassed a range of topics here, so it might be a good time to come to a close. So I might just say thanks to the panelists. I appreciate all of your expertise and enthusiasm for this topic. It seems pretty clear that there's a consensus from a range of different perspectives across the panel that congestion charging is a good idea for New Zealand. Even into some really interesting details, seem to be some consensus emerging in terms of what the point of a scheme should be, and how you get the public on board, how you continue to have them be effective, and how we design them in practice. So I really appreciate that discussion. I also appreciate everyone coming along and putting cool questions in the chat. We got to get through quite a lot of them. That was great. And sorry for the few questions left that we didn't get through. So thanks so much, everyone. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you. It was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nadine. And thank you very much to all our panelists, Eric, Scott, Mehmet, and Carly, for what was a very lively and well-informed discussion. I hope to see some of you back next Tuesday, 1 p.m. for our next and final webinar of the year on residential insurance. The role of residential insurance in adapting to climate change. And finally, do keep a lookout for the feedback forms from today's webinars that should appear in your browser or in your inbox. So it'd be great to hear what you think. Until next time, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.